Good evening. Welcome to week 3 of PSSL 6240, Political Violence and Terrorism at George Washington University in the Safety and Security Leadership Program. I'm doing something a little bit different here. I want to kind of do this on the screen. So with a paper coming up, I want to show you how a previous paper was good, what was good about it, and hopefully give you some ideas when you write your first paper for this course. Before I get to that, just want to cover some announcements. Adobe Connect session this Thursday, September 11th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You already have the link, and the group that's going knows what they're doing. What we're going to do is just a quick intro. We're going to go right to the group that is presenting. That will probably give you some ideas for your paper if you haven't completed it yet by Thursday. And what I'll do is I will stay a little bit later if you want to just talk one-on-one about your papers, if you're coming on issues or any problems. So please, if you're not going to be at that Adobe Connect session, let me know. I'm doing it as much as a service to you guys so you can get your paper started and flesh out any ideas before it's due. And paper 1, I'm sorry. Let me change that. Paper 1 is due next Sunday. So get it to me 11:59 p.m. next Sunday. I'm not going to give too much room for extensions. I'm going to say that right off the bat. If there's an emergency or some issue, that's fine. But I'm going to be pretty. I'm not going to give too much room on that. So again, if there's any issues with Adobe Connect or the paper, please let me know as soon as possible. So review of last week with specific focus on what is terrorism, what is not terrorism. One thing that I want in your paper is to discuss this piece, this facets of terrorism piece. And what I mean by that is each one of those definitions and each one of those incidents that I talked about last week has a particular facet that determines whether it is or isn't terrorism. And I don't know if those fell out in the, or hopefully those fell out in the lecture as well as in the discussion section. But some of the ones that I noticed in the discussion that you could bring up in your paper, military versus non-military. Is it terrorism? And I put up 2 examples. I put up the USS Cole and an IED attack in Iraq. Most people said the USS Cole was not terrorism, or was terrorism, and the IED attack was not terrorism. And I would ask, why? What were the differences? And that's why I put those 2 examples up. And the other question is, should attacks on military be considered terrorism, even if we're not at war, or U.S. Cole was not under fire or conducting direct action? So that's someone's already asked about that paper topic, but that's kind of one facet that we discussed in the last week, that military versus non-military. The other facet, state-based versus non-state-based. Even in Hoffman's definition, there was a terrorist group has to have a non-state basis. And when many people talked about Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they said it wasn't terrorism because it was a state base. It was a declared war by a nation state. And so some people have said, hey, it can't be terrorism if it's state-based. But then you bring up the counter-argument that says there is state-based terrorism. Iran is a state-based sponsor of terrorists. Syria, before it became a basket case, was a state-based example of terrorism. So that's another facet that you can agree or disagree with, that you can put forth. The other, type of target. We already discussed here military versus non-military, but is there a difference between killing a group of adults who are part of the apparatus that is oppressing you, if you're a terrorist group or an insurgent group, versus blowing up a kid's bar mitzvah or a pizza parlor? Does one make terrorism and one make non-terrorism? If you're blowing up a hardened structure that's full of military, is that not terrorism, while a bar mitzvah and a civilian soft target is terrorism? That's something that, again, could either reinforce your point, the type of target. Group motivations. If the group is associated with the political movement, it tends to be terrorism. That's why I brought up the Columbine shooting. Most people would say that's not terrorism because of the motivations of those two individuals, those two guys who committed that attack. While someone like Hassan at Fort Hood had a different motivation, had more of a political motivation. That's something that could, again, strengthen your argument. That's a facet of terrorism that can prove whether it's a terrorist organization, not a terrorist organization, that could kind of help your argument a little bit more. You could also go the other way and say, hey, a guy who is trying to, and you'll see this in the example, the Hamas example, if you're trying to liberate territory, you're a freedom fighter. If there's someone trying to oppress you. However, if you're like Hamas and your charter says we need to extinguish Israel, then that is a far different motivation. It's hard to say that you're a freedom fighter or an anti-colonial warrior if your motivation is to extinguish Israel or extinguish another group. So that's another facet, again, that could reinforce. Tactics used. This is kind of obsequious a little bit, but one could make the argument that if you're more brutal in your tactics, you should be aligned with terrorism. If you use suicide bombings arbitrarily to kill people, to kill civilians, that makes you much more of a terrorist than if you were to shoot up a military barracks. Those are the types of things that might put you in the terrorism category, vice freedom fighter categories, the type of tactics you use. Whether we are at war or not, this was something brought up in the Dresden argument, is, hey, we were at war, so bombing Dresden could not be terrorism. The counter argument to that is Osama bin Laden declares war, and who's to say that what he did on 9/11 wasn't part of his declared war? Whether we are at war or not could say, hey, this is a military action vice a terrorist incident, or it could say, hey, who decides whether we are at war or not? And that's a topic you can explore in your paper. Oppression level of group. There's a reason why we celebrate Mandela, Nelson Mandela, and we let him, even though he was responsible and planned attacks against that could be considered terrorism, we could say, hey, that's acceptable because the apartheid regime was so brutal that the group could be more considered freedom fighters. Again, obviously, eye of the beholder there, but in your papers, you'll have to discuss that in detail. Civilian targeting within the locus of conflict vice civilian targeting outside the locus of conflict. I think the Irgun example brought up a good case. We can say what the Irgun did was more acceptable or not considered terrorism because their attacks were focused on the locus of conflict within Israel. If they chose to bomb targets in London or in New York to bring attention to their cause, then they might be more of a terrorist group than if they chose to keep it within the locus of conflict. The same thing for the Algerians, the FLN. They were focused on civilians, but within the locus of conflict within Algeria. If they chose to attack civilians in Paris, then they wouldn't really be freedom fighters. They would be now terrorists because they're going, again, their attacks are more nihilistic. And then finally, attacks on the apparatus of oppression. Again, this goes with the Mandela case. It goes with the Irgun. It goes with the FLN, is that many of their attacks were, as opposed to on random civilians, on the apparatus of oppression. And you saw that in the videos, that their attacks, particularly in the Irgun case, were against not random civilians as much, but British diplomatic officials, British ministerial officials, British military that were part of the apparatus. It certainly weren't innocent in the same aspect that we would say people going to a party or a bar mitzvah or a pizza party were. So those are all facets here, and there's probably more that we discussed that you could say, hey, either approve my point or disprove my point, or I need to address as a counter argument, and I'll go in detail. I hope this has made things a little bit clear, but each one of these facets, you guys discussed when trying to compare and contrast or determine whether Dresden was terrorism, or the Fort Hood shooting, the first Fort Hood shooting, was terrorism. And there's probably more that, again, you can bring up in your paper. And just to kind of clarify the example, Israel, again, it's debatable, but you can make the argument because of the Holocaust, the Irgun was a highly oppressed group that focused on the apparatus of government, not on random civilians, and their focus was on the locus of conflict. So you can make the argument that the Irgun was not a terrorist organization, and you'll see that more clearly in a bit, but that because of these facets, they were not a terrorist organization. Again, it's subject to the beholder, but here's an argument. The FLN, you can kind of a little bit make the counter argument a little bit. They were not as oppressed, or at least certainly didn't have the Holocaust as a backdrop as the Irgun did. They were focused on civilians as opposed to the Irgun, which is focused primarily on military. The FLN was focused primarily on civilians. However, they were within the locus of conflict. So it may not be a terrorist group, but a bad actor. Al-Qaeda, not really oppressed. Again, in the eye of the beholder, I guess, but if Osama bin Laden's oppression was due to American involvement in Saudi Arabia or having American bases, that's certainly not as oppressive as the Irgun in the Holocaust. Their primary focus was on civilians, if you put the 9/11 attacks in there, and they were certainly outside the locus of conflict. So this, under these criteria, Al-Qaeda is much more of a terrorist organization, while maybe the Irgun is not. So I hope that clears things up. If there's any questions or issues, please let me know. And before I go into kind of an example paper, I want to cover a preview of next week. What we're going to see is the road to 9/11. And what I'm asking while you're watching this documentary, it's a very good documentary and very educational documentary. It was made in about 2004, 2005, so it's a little old, but it's still pretty good overview. And as you're going through the road to 9/11, you're reading the Zakaria article, think, what are the social, political, demographic, economic factors that contributed to 9/11? And actually, I should say contributed to 9/11 as well as contributed to that hatred. I don't know if everyone remembers this, but after 9/11, there were celebrations in much of the Muslim world after the attack. So why? Why did that happen? What were those social, political, demographic, and economic factors? And one thing you're going to see this debate happen, and that's why I have your discussion section occur, is did 9/11 have deep historical roots, or are the factors more recent? The road to 9/11 kind of goes back to the early 1900s and say that had an impact on why we're seeing the violence up to 9/11. The Zakaria article says, no, we have to look maybe a little bit closer, maybe in the late 1960s, 1970s. So that's an interesting debate, and that'll be one of your discussion questions. The next point, terrorism finance. One thing I wanted to say is that as opposed to the other PowerPoint lectures you received, this is a static PowerPoint. You don't hear my wonderful voice speaking. And then you'll see the Terry Inc. and Lemieux article, which you'll talk about in the discussion section. So before we go on, I want to kind of cover an example paper that I thought was pretty good, that is a pretty good example of your paper 1. I don't want you to rip this off. I don't want you to take this as a word for word. Even if you take the themes of this, I'm going to be pretty irritated. I'm sharing this with you because knowing that I want to give you an example and knowing that many of you have not written a paper in a while. So what this is a guy is trying to compare, he sets this scenario up, and I'll give you a second to read it. Go ahead, pause me so you can read this scenario. But you can choose a scenario, you can do what you want, but he chose that, and that's fine. And he kind of made this as an official memorandum to the president. And you can imagine the president is debating Ahmadinejad in this little paper. This paper's a little old, but he's debating Ahmadinejad, and he wants to counter the argument that he's going to get that the Hamas is just a bunch of freedom fighters. They're not terrorists. They're just like the FLN, the Irgun, and the freedom fighters beforehand. So what this paper is and how I want it is, I want you to choose three of those facets that I think distinguish your argument. So in this case, he chooses the context, and I'll let you go ahead and kind of read this. But he chooses the context to explain that yes, the Hamas is, first example, that the context that Hamas is a far different historical animal than the FLN or the Irgun or any of those post-colonial freedom fighters. So he goes in and he goes to detail and does a good compare and contrast between Hamas and the FLN and the Irgun, which bring give a pretty good overview. Next facet, he looks at motivation, and again he's comparing and contrasting Hamas with the motivations of those anti-colonial terrorist groups or anti-colonial insurgents, and he says that the motivation is far different. Hamas is calling for the replacement of Israel and the Palestinian territories with an Islamic State. The FLN, when they were in Algeria, wasn't calling for the replacement of the French government. The Irgun was never calling for a replacement of the British government, but Hamas is calling for a replacement of the Israeli government. So that makes it a terrorist group or much more of a insidious group than any of those freedom fighters. And finally, compare and contrast the tactics. And again, we've talked about this. I talked about this earlier. The tactics of the FLN, the FLN, the Irgun were far different than Hamas. They never blew up civilians outside the locus of conflict. Hamas does that all the time. Hamas blows up civilians in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, or at least they had. They continue to point rockets. They use nihilistic random bombings with debris and nails inside the bombs to make their point. So those are the tactics that separate it. And that furthers the argument that Hamas should be considered a terrorist organization. And then what he does next is just counter arguments. And he anticipates, and this is what I want you to do, is I want you to anticipate counter arguments. These are some, and I'll give you a second to read these. These are some of the counter arguments that he chooses. Israel uses terror to achieve its political goals, and he uses those counter arguments to strengthen that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I'll let you read this for a second. He brings this counter argument. You can anticipate Iran, if they're debating the President Obama, is going to bring up something like this in their argument. So he brings up number 2. He brings up number 3. And again, if you know the history, this will be something that the Iranians choose. So again, and then he puts a one paragraph. The one thing he doesn't do is policy recommendations and a conclusion. But that's the one thing that I would add that you need to put in your papers. So with that being said, I hope this was a good example. If there's any questions or issues, please let me know, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.